All right, I guess we'll get started. I wanted to start a little bit after just to give people time, and as you can see, there is an empty seat. We have our second guest coming a little bit late because they have a prior engagement. So hey everybody, welcome. It's great to have you here. I'm Sam Orndorff. I'm a geography PhD candidate here, and don't want to cough into the mic. Yeah, we're going to get started. So I just want to, before we kick off, just give thanks to the Digital Humanities Center, the DHC here, to Patrick, to Pam, to Lainey, to Sophia, everybody who's helped us make this podcast. Of course, I want to give the land acknowledgement that we're on Kumeyaay land. This is occupied Kumeyaay lands and other indigenous peoples, the Cupeño, the Luiseño, the Ipai, and other nations who moved through here throughout space and time. And I think, as with any acknowledgement, that's really just a speech act. And what you decide to do with that, it's kind of up to you, right? It's really only the beginning. What you do as an individual, now that you have the knowledge of whose lands you're on, whose homelands you're on, that's up to you. And what you do as part of the institutions and the groups that you're part of, that's also up to you. But yeah, so a little very short background on our climate talks here. This is actually the 5th annual thing, if you can believe it. So it really started in 2019, a dialogue between myself and Corey Monteverde. We talked about, we really want to create a space and a forum for students and the public to discuss climate change where there would otherwise be no forum and no space. So that's really kind of where it came up. Then the pandemic happened, so that was great. But we ended up having our first year in 2021. It was planned in 2020, and we had it online. Did anybody attend the first year? No? Okay, that's fine. It was a marathon. It was like 6 hours long. Then the next year, we really on 2022, we really focused on indigenous voices, traditional ecological knowledge that's held by traditional practitioners in indigenous communities. The next year, we really dug even deeper into that. So that was in 2023. That was our first year in person, and that was actually in the theater. And we had people there who I've been working with from the People of Red Mountain, which is an indigenous-based community organization. They do work in the Great Basin region to protect their sacred landscapes from extractive lithium mining. A lot of those lithium mines have been slated for that region all across California and Nevada, and almost all of them are right next to or fully within indigenous territories, reservations, and within the traditional homelands of a lot of groups who have been historically oppressed and marginalized. And so we began that dialogue last year with some of our guests. Go back and check that out. It is on the YouTube page. And then the following year, which was last year, we made a documentary, dug even deeper into that. And that was also my research project for my dissertation. So that's called People of Red Mountain, Life Over Lithium, really looking in depth about how is this community dealing with mining that's already been there for several hundred years and is now being framed as this green solution to climate change. So check that out. So that's really what we had in mind. And hopefully you got a chance to listen to some of our previous episodes. Did anybody attend a previous podcast? I shouldn't do show of hands. This is audio. So give me a woo or a clap if did you ever attend a previous climate talk? Okay, thank you. I'm trying to break the ice here. Did anybody listen to the podcast? Give me a woo. All right, sweet. I know Judy did. You were on one. You were literally present. Does anybody a geography major? Okay, all right. All right, now here's one. Is anybody graduating in spring? All right, congratulations. If you are, and you're taking your graduation photos, and you're throwing plastic confetti out, you need to go up and pick up every single piece. I will personally withhold your degree. All right, last question, and we can filter out who's on board here. This is not serious. No, this is serious. Does anybody work in oil, gas, or coal mines? Okay, good. You can stay. You're good. You can stay. No, I'm just kidding. I'm trying to lighten the mood. I do have more jokes. Do you want to hear more jokes? All right. Why did the chicken cross the road? No, I'm just kidding. Did you know there are more chickens than people? Oh, now you do. Okay. Actually, why did the chicken cross the road? You know, it's a classic setup, but have you ever seen a chicken crossing a road? We consider them to be the cowardly animals, but they're actually really brave. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. What else do I want to say? So, Judy, today you texted the group and you almost gave me a heart attack because you said, "Did you hear back from Ryan?" And I was like, "Who the hell are you talking about?" And then she's like, "Oh, my bad. Never mind. That's the wrong name of the person." But yeah, there's a lot of work and thought that goes into this. I just uploaded the previous episode last night. It is about, well, it's really about why it's a hot take for me personally about why I think cars are ruining the planet. But what spurred that whole radicalizing process was I got hit by a truck about 13 years ago, and they drove away. And in the meantime, I've been thinking about how cars take up too much space of our lives and our cities, and they're polluting a lot. So that's the last episode, episode 8. If you want to hear Judy's interview, that is episode 5. And so we do want to hear from you all. That would be awesome. That's really the format here. We'll keep it lighthearted, hopefully keep it accessible. But before I introduce the speakers, I just want to say that I'm really honored that you're all here. And if you are working in any kind of environmental field, if you're working in humanities, please keep up the good work. There's a lot that needs to happen, especially under this current administration. And, you know, if you look at the way that we do environmental policy, the way that we talk about climate change, if you've listened to the podcast, you probably know, or if you're listening in your classes, there's not enough work that's being done, and we need all hands on deck because with this fight, we have to win. The climate connects us all. Okay, that's enough from me. And now that our guests are here, I'm going to open up the floor here a little bit. So we're very honored that we have our 2 guests. So this is our first time that we've actually been able to host faculty at San Diego State. Previously, we had other people come from all around the country, but next to me, we have Dr. Samantha Bova. And she is a paleoceanographer and paleoclimatologist, which means that she researches how the Earth's climate has changed over time. Her work has been helping to solve a big mystery in climate science about why models of climate change in the past 12,000 years have not always lined up with available temperature data. So let's give Samantha Bova a big round of applause for joining us. All right. And then just joining us now, we have Dr. Lluvia Flores-Renteria, who is an ecologist interested in phylogenetics, population genetics, evolution of reproductive systems, and the evolutionary ecology of plant-insect microbe interactions under climate change. Using greenhouse experiments, common garden studies, field experiments, and next-generation sequencing techniques, she studies the genetic and environmental contributions to drought resistance in plants and the interplay between the responses of different plant genotypes and species and their associated microbes and insects to the stresses of climate change. In her research, she also combines phylogenetics, molecular genetics, epigenetics, population genetics, physiological, morphological, developmental, and ecological approaches. So please give Dr. Flores-Renteria a big round of applause for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So have you 2 met before, and this is your first time meeting? Okay, now they have. Yeah, so this is really just an opportunity for you 2 to talk, to break down those barriers. We as geographers like to call ourselves the interdisciplinary discipline. You know, we bring together those different spheres, the biosphere, the atmosphere, hydrosphere, et cetera. The lithosphere. Sorry, there's a geologist in the house. So I really want to keep this kind of just talking about your personal experiences and talking about what got you into this in the first place. And that was kind of my opening question, like for both of you. Just could you tell us, maybe there was a class or maybe there was like a moment even where you just kind of realized, like, I want to be in science and I want to think about climate change in this really intensified way. So do you want to start us, Dr. Sam Bova?
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's really exciting. Yeah, I mean, I actually was one of those kids who grew up pretty much from day one knowing that they wanted to be a scientist. I spent summers and after school in the backyard digging in the dirt, collecting rocks. We would go to the beach, and I afraid of the water at that point. And so I would just collect shells on the beach. And then when I got home, I would come home and I would put them in little baggies and categorize them and figure out what kind they were. And that really continued. And I just kind of always had a fascination with the natural world around me. And I was in high school, I had a geo-environmental class, which is, I think, actually fairly uncommon to have that before you get into college. And it cemented in me that this is something that I can make a career out of. I can study this in college. And I actually knew when I set day one on campus that I wanted to be either an earth scientist or an environmental scientist or both. And then in classes in college, I realized I could kind of do exactly what I did when I was a little kid at the beach collecting seashells, but now I go out on expeditions on ships out into the ocean to collect sediment cores, and then I sieve those out and find microscopic seashells. I categorize them and look at their geochemistry, and then I can figure out how climate has evolved through time. So I don't think that's everyone's path, that you kind of knew for a very long time that you were going to do something in science and definitely something in kind of environmental fields. But for me, it all flowed kind of nicely in this kind of continuous pathway until here I am today. So,
right.
For me, it was like totally opposite. yeah, because I was very connected to nature. I have dogs and rabbits and animals at home, and I was very connected. I grew up close by to Mexico City before it became a monster. But then I was actually into opera. I was getting trained as an opera singer and more into the arts, like a theater and things like that. And my dad was like, "Oh, you should do medical school," as many dads want. And then I was like, "Go." So I negotiated, and my negotiation was like, "Oh, maybe biology." I was kind of forced, but I was in one of my classes, and I had this phenomenal professor, Judith Marquez, and she was talking about the sex in plants, and it blew my mind. It was like, they do what? And the pollen travels this much, and it really, I still remember how inside of me something sparked and kind of grew from it. And I was just sitting like fascinated, and I'm very passionate now about plants. And before I even started in biology, I was like, okay, biology, but not plants. I will do genetics or something. I was kind of dismissive because I was just totally ignorant. And I like to tell that to my students because sometimes we are just finding our paths and finding our journey. And I like to share that because, sometimes if you are just trying to find your own journey, it's like everybody has different paths, and that's mine. And then little by little I started getting more involved into plants dying. Like I was interested why are plants dying and what I can do to alleviate that. And I started researching about interactions with microbes, interactions with pollinators, our contribution to that, and so things like that. It became gradually, for me it was a gradual progress, but then I'm all full in now, and I get paid to travel and to study this, so
That's excellent. Yeah, and I wanted to mention, we'll do our questions here, we'll have an intermission around 5 till, then we'll have audience questions, so please keep those in mind. I feel like every climate talk, every year we always run out of time for audience questions, so we have a full chunk of time for that. But yeah, that's great that you were both, it's kind of like something inside of you just drew you into the science. And I think I've heard that a lot of people who get into geological, biological, especially with plants, the cool thing about plants and rocks is they can't run away. So you can really study them in depth. But that's great. So then how does then climate come into that? Because this would have been something that you learn the sort of baseline, and then we all have this shifting that's happening in the background where things are getting warmer. Most regions around us are getting drier. Where did the climate start to come into that? Or was there like a moment as well for that kind of sparked that aspect?
Yeah, I don't know if I can pinpoint a particular moment when, climate became the focus. I would wear these, environmental sweatshirts and was always, very concerned about local to global environmental challenges. And, I think as I was going through college, climate change was becoming more and more the issue. And, you can obviously tackle it from a whole suite of different angles, but I can't pinpoint like the moment that it happened where climate became my focus, but it just was becoming more and more of the pressing issue of the time. And it's also just inherently interesting. Even a lot of my work is motivated by understanding our future climate and what that means for us and choices that we should make. But it's also just inherently interesting. It's a complex system, and we don't completely understand it. And there's a lot of progress to be made there, and I think that was just exciting for me.
For me, I think it was when I was in my PhD, I did some research in pines, pinyon pines in Mexico. And I had to live in a very rural community with, there was only like 9 families in that rural place. Very poor, very loving. And then I was studying these 2 pines. I didn't know at the time that there were 2. But I actually gathered the information from them because they said, one is the El Pino Bueno, which means like the good pine. And the other one is the donkey pine, El Pino Burro, because the other ones weren't producing pine nuts, right? Okay. And so they knew, and I go, what? There are 2 pines here? So I started getting more interested in understanding the 2 species. And after that, I was invited to go to Northern Arizona University to study a pinyon pine that is like a barometer for climate change. That's Pinus edulis. It's an edible, as the other ones as well. They produce the pine nuts, which are very important and very significant for the tribal communities as well. And we actually eat them in many forms in Mexico still. You should eat them, guys. They are very delicious, very tasty. And so I was starting to pay more attention. So in the Southwest, we have this species in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. And they started declining massively in the last few decades. And now I have expanded my research into areas in California, Baja California, where we have close relative species, and they are disappearing. So we are disappearing in our eyes, and we are actually have a lot of research on them. And they are big trees, pines, which for me blew my mind that we still don't have that much information. So I think it was gradual, but it was at that time when I realized that some of them were not producing seeds, and I started paying attention about the deaths of trees. And trees are super important for the ecosystems. So when we have little plants, I mean, every species is important, but there are some that are foundational species that are going to be supporting the communities. And if we lose those trees, we are in big trouble. So that's a lot of the things that I do research in my lab.
Wow. So the way I heard that, I don't know if this is true, but I was talking to people who have taken your class before and worked with you. It sounds like there was a little bit of that grassroots, traditional knowledge about the differences in those that might look the same to the average person in those 2, the burro versus the bueno. And is it true that almost every type of pine has some kind of like edible needle or seed? Or almost every pine? I don't know if that's true.
No, there are like around 110 species of pines around the world in in the northern hemisphere, and we have several in here. But the pinyon pines, they are, depending on the author, there are around 11 to 14 species or so, and there are others that are also edible. As a matter of fact, most of the pesto that you guys might be eating, we put the pine nuts, but they are actually pines from Asia, which it's like, why are we not eating the pine nuts that we have more locally? So there is not business or company selling them. You can find them sometimes on internet. On the internet, you can order them and roast them, and they're cool. But Yeah, so not every pine produce pine nuts.
Got you. Yeah, it's a very important original food for the people I'm working with in Nevada, the Paiuchistoni people. I think they call it tuba. It's a very traditional harvest in the August, maybe September, October. Right. Yeah. And so pines are a very old species, right? In terms of how long they've been around on planet Earth. And you're also looking back and you're going into those deep layers of sediment. So let's talk a little bit about the methods that you're using and how do you peer into, are you using dendrochronology? Are you looking down into the layers of sediment? Like, how do you get a picture of what Earth was like in that longer ago time period to see the long time scale over what's changed over those last hundreds of years and thousands of years?
Yeah, sure. So pretty much all of my work works on marine sediments. So we go out into the ocean and we core. So large ships out there for months at a time and coring and drilling into the seafloor, and then we recover those. And you're starting from the sediment water interface, and that's more or less present day, and then you're going back in time. And I look for different geochemical signatures that get left behind in the geologic record. Most of those come from organisms that were living, physical shells. Like I was saying, I now sieve and pick out little microscopic shells of zooplankton, foraminifera. I look at their geochemistry, and I look for molecular fossils that get left behind in the sediment record. We basically just have to be creative, right? We like to think of ourselves as like little detectives that go out, and we have to try to piece together the clues to figure out what the climate was like when that organism was living. So I use a whole bunch of different kinds of geochemical approaches to do this work, and we wherever we get our core, we make our analyses going down core, and we get this time history of all kinds of stuff. So we can do temperature, we can think about salinity of the ocean, we can reconstruct past changes in productivity. Sometimes, depending on where, I often work in margin environments near land, and so we see kind of stuff coming off the landscape. I have projects looking at past changes in rainfall, looking at rates of erosion offshore, or changes in the extent of ice sheets by looking at erosional products that get washed out to sea and collected. So there's an amazing array of things you can kind of peer into, and it's critical because our instrumental records are only going back a couple hundred years or so, if we're lucky. And that doesn't encompass the full range of variability of our climate system. And, you see all of these things in the headlines like, this is unprecedented. Okay, like compared to what, right? So this is what our work is, basically how we figure that out. Is it warmer than it's ever been? No, right? Like, is it warming faster? Potentially, yes. And so it's the records that we generate looking into Earth history that allow us to make those kinds of claims. So yeah, we do. It's super fun. The fun parts are going out to sea. And it's a really amazing experience being out there collecting our samples, and then lots and lots of hours in the lab and thinking about what it all means. Because nothing is a direct recorder. That's the other challenge, right? So we're not going back in time with a thermometer. We're kind of looking at, this organism changed the number of double bonds in this particular molecule based on temperature, but it might have also done that for other reasons too, and trying to, figure out all those different potential causes. So yeah, I'll stop there because I can go on forever about the kinds of fun things that we do to try to figure out the climate and ocean history.
And also adding to the type of tools, like in talking about pines, the cool thing about pines is that the pollen dispersed by wind, right? They are wind pollinated, so they produce massive amount of pollen. And they have a very curious morphology. They have like a Mickey Mouse pollen, because they have these airbags that help them float in the wind. And then that's very useful for you guys, because you look at this at the core of the sediments, and then you can see back that you have a lot of pines, and now it's a desert. Oh, well, not a desert if there's a core, but there is very different type of vegetation now, and those are very useful. And talking about pines, the things that I look at, for example, we might be looking at the production of reproductive structures. We call them like microstrobilized, the male cones. They have, they left scars in the branches. And you can imagine if the year was very good, they have a lot of water and resources, they are gonna have a lot of production of these microstrobilites, these cones. But if not, it's gonna be very short. And you could retrace back in time, obviously just in the last decade, right? You cannot be going back. Going back, you can look at the dendrochronology, which is you core the tree, look at the rings, and you can trace how good the time was. And we have Pinus longeva, which is one of the species that can live for 5,000, 7,000 years. So that's, but some others live just a few hundred years. The other thing that is relevant to say is that pines, in order to become mature, they sometimes start producing the cones after 40 years, 50 years. So things that you see producing cones now, they might be older, and we don't appreciate sometimes the time that have passed. But a lot of the methods that we use, for example, are in genomics. So my lab does a lot of genomics. So we look into genes to see how far in time these species evolve, and in what circumstances, in what geological times. So that's what we do as well. And other tools that we use extensively is the niche modeling. So trying to go to see how was in time the distribution of this species, and trying to see if the conditions that they experiencing now were matching this location in other locations. So that's kind of the sort of tools that we use for that, and some others.
Gotcha. Okay, so then what? Once you do that, what are you starting to see? What are you seeing in those samples that you're collecting out there at sea? I'm also curious, like what's that like as a person out on the ocean like that? But yeah, so you have fossils, you have rocks. You can see whether those used to be living creatures deeper in time, and you can see those those signatures that you're seeing in the pines too. And what is that telling us about the last chunk of time since the last ice age?
Yeah, so a lot of my work recently has been focused on the last 10,000 years or so, or the Holocene. So it's the kind of current warm interval that happened after the last glacial period. And we have these interglacials, so the Holocene is just the most recent example of it, that occur in between ice ages. And so we're seeing all different kinds of things in the sediment. But that's I work on the Holocene in part because it's the baseline from which our modern climate change problem starts from, right? And it's the time over which human civilization grew and agriculture was started, and a lot of advances in human culture over this time interval. It is a period, it's a test bed for climate models. If a lot of our climate models are simulating climate during this period, we're comparing them to the proxy records of climate that we get from geologic archives, and is the model functioning well? Does it match the data? So the recent work that I've done on this interval is that, others have shown this too, is that the climate models actually don't match the data. So climate models are showing a long-term warming trend over the last 10,000 years, and after which the modern warming is off the charts from that. But our proxy data, that a lot of it is coming from the marine realm, but of course You can do terrestrial paleoclimate too. That is also a really awesome field of research. But on our proxy data are telling us that the warmest period over the last 10,000 years was about 6,000 years ago, a Holocene thermal maximum, and then temperatures cooled towards the industrial era and then reversed towards to where we are now. And those are really different trajectories, and it calls into question a lot of things, right? So why aren't our models capturing what the data say? And because it's the same models that are then being used to project into the future. And so what I'm actually finding is that I have to think about biology, because our recorders of past changes in ocean temperature were made by organisms, mostly plankton. And these things don't live very long, and they have particular times of year in which they're happier and they're producing more. And so I think actually the reconciliation, what we found in our recent data, is that what we thought were mean annual recorders of temperature are actually seasonal recorders of temperature. And the evolution of temperature during different seasons looks quite different over this time interval. And so if you account for seasonality in our temperature records from the Holocene, then the models and the data actually line up really nicely. And so that gives us a lot of confidence that our models are doing a really good job of simulating the climate system, and therefore we can have greater confidence of them moving into the future. It's still controversial. Of course, not everyone is. There's excellent scientific banter in terms of trying to figure out, where the evidence lies. But it's a kind of a nice reconciliation in terms of all of the data can now kind of reflect the same thing. So we're just kind of comparing apples to oranges before. So that's a big challenge that I've kind of been working on recently with my marine sediment cores, but that's just kind of one line of work.
In my case, is I don't work with a particular geological time. It's more like at the plants of this region that I'm focusing on. So I work with pines, but also I work with 10 other more systems. And all of them are plants that have a binational distribution. And most of them also are used by tribal communities. So there is a social relevance or cultural relevance. And because of that, it depends on the region, they might have evolved more recently or more ancient. And so if we think about our region, right, in California, and we are also close to Baja California. So the Baja California Peninsula, or the peninsula of Baja California, moved or separated, split from the main land 5 million, 7 million years ago, right? And it moved and separated the flora. And with that, there were a lot of changes, gradual changes. So some of the plants that I work with evolved with that separation, but it was actually gradual, right? Like little by little. We actually are experiencing those movements like you felt the earthquake just a few days ago, right? Because we're just in this tectonic plate connection. Anyways, but then some of the plants are evolving more recently in the Pleistocene with the aridification of the desert, the Vizcaíno Desert. And some of my plants, I look a lot of desert plants, the cactus, and they are super interesting to look at. And they started diversifying some of our deserts more recently. So it really depends on what plants I'm looking at is the story that I can tell, like in geological times. But more recently, we were looking at how plants are responding to these more abrupt changes, to the climate change that we're experiencing now. Mm-hmm. And we're doing some experiments. We have an experiment with a monkey flower we are having 3 common garden experiments in California. And we are looking at 6 different provenances through the whole distribution. These plants distributes across California and beyond. And then we're testing how it's responding to climate change. And some of them are we are testing if they change the phenology. At what time are they producing the flowers? Are they trying to escape the intense summers that we are experiencing now, and then maybe they are moving the flowering earlier? All of these things, are they investing more into the root system or in the height? Are they producing more seeds instead? And so those are the things that we're looking at more right now, the effects of climate change to plants right now.
Are the plants also, well, individuals are not able to move. Are they able to kind of geographically redistribute up slopes to get more cooler temperatures? How are they? Yeah, because it's already dry too. That's the other thing. It
really is species dependent. Okay. And so plants move in different ways. I want to say that, like, plants do move in different ways. Yeah. And one of the things that they move their gametes, they move the pollen, right? Okay. They move the seeds. So different seeds have different dispersal ranges. And they can move just by dropping the seeds. Like, some of them have wings, actually, that they can float. Some of the pines actually have wings. And others, like the pinyon pines, actually evolved to have something that we call the megagametophytes. The nutritive tissue is quite big, and that's why those seeds are chubby. And they are propagated or distributed, there's a special word for that, dispersed by jays and by rodents and by things that are very, they precious. They really love those type of seeds. Same thing with the acorns. You know, the woodpeckers are just dispersing them. So it might depend on the range of these birds or these rodents, how much they can travel, and maybe try to hidden this, like squirrels, right? Like they forget about this, and then you have a tree later, something like that. Mm-hmm.
Nice. Okay, so you both kind of touched on this. It's almost like you're adding a layer of complexity. So I want to take it back. Maybe this is just me, but so do you think it's right? And I've talked about this on the podcast, so maybe I have to add a new episode, but should we be thinking about the human's role in industrial burning of fossil fuels the way that we are now, where we're talking about like roughly 1750 when we started burning coal and oil and all this other stuff? That's when we started to see these dramatic rises that can't be explained in the records that we have. Do you think that's still an accurate picture based on what you're seeing and the way you think about the grand scheme of climate?
That's a good question. And I think it's controversial, but yeah. So, one of the hypotheses is that humans actually started to have an impact on climate much earlier than the Industrial Revolution. Okay. And for example, in the mid-Holocene, there is a hypothesis. It's called the Ruddiman hypothesis, that large-scale changes in rice paddy agriculture, land clearing for agriculture, really is going to release methane as well as CO2. And if you look at the evolution of greenhouse gases over the Holocene, they are pretty unique relative to previous interglacial periods. So there's a number of these kind of warm intervals interspersed between glacial periods over the last 1 million years or so. And it is hypothesized that potentially that rise in CO2 and methane actually could come from changes in agriculture and land clearance. And it's still kind of back and forth in the literature. There's been a lot of work looking at carbon isotopes and other geochemical tracers that the signature of the carbon is not really actually consistent with methane and land clearance and it coming from there. And it looks more like an oceanic source of carbon rather than from these terrestrial systems. But that's also been challenged that if humans poked the system a little bit, maybe it changed the way the ocean was circulating and the carbon was then released from the ocean. So I would say it's an interesting thought experiment, and I don't think we know the answer for sure. And it's actually one of the reasons why looking at previous interglacials, which is another thing that I've been working on recently, I think is useful, because the question really is the Holocene unique? and why is that the case relative to other examples when we think people were having less of an impact on the climate system. So not 100% sure, but it certainly is possible that we've been having a significant impact on atmospheric gases and climate for much longer than we traditionally think.
Wow.
No, I agree. I agree completely. And I think definitely there is more and more research supporting that agriculture. It has taken a big toll in this situation. And that's one of the reasons why also my research now is more looking into the agricultural systems and also some of the grants. And because I also think that we need to look this in a very complex way, more multidisciplinary, because agriculture has a lot of layers of complexity in which you also are looking at the lack of biodiversity, the transformation of the land, the clearance, and the modification of the biodiversity, not only the plants and animals, but the soil, which is super important, and the how your health gets unhealthy. And once that you get a very desertified soil, it's very, very hard to bring it back, right? And there has been some initiatives, like, for example, people thinking that, let's just plant 1 million and millions of trees around the world, and kind of seem actually very logical. And now we know that actually for the first 40 years, trees are going to be emitting methane. And it's just like our limitation of the system, or our ignorance in the system, that might make us make the wrong decision. So I think in my mind, we need to just use all the possible approaches that we can think, because otherwise we're going to be in big troubles, right? So how can we do it in a holistic way rather than just say, okay, let's just stop using the cars and just bicycle everybody, right? Because there has been also initiatives in that regard, but this is more holistic. And then I think that we have to explore, have more research to actually guide us, like where is the best possible outcome. And I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, well, that's really surprising. I mean, it sounds to me like we in the human geography, environmental, social sciences have yet to catch on to that idea, at least the way that it's talked about from my training. So maybe there really needs to be more interdisciplinary dialogue. But one of my concerns would be like, kind of finger pointing, or maybe like, well, who built the rice paddies? Let's blame Asia and blame Asian people or something like that. It happens. I've seen it in class. Or environmental determinism, to think like, well, humans are so limited by their environments when we actually can do amazing things and learn from different trial and error. So that's good to know. Way more complexity than I realized at first. But what do you think about? So you touched a little bit on the soil, and I guess that dips into your other work in microbes. And that's a whole other layer that's completely, invisible to the naked eye. So where do you see that interaction? Because the soil, over deep geologic time, the soil came out of the erosional forces and wind and water, and then also was created through the buildup of decomposing biological organisms. And so it's so important, but we just think it's just dirt, whatever, who needs dirt, right? So what about the soil, and what about those microbes that you're seeing?
Yeah. They are really key in this process. So I was very lucky when I moved to Northern Arizona University. I was with Dr. Catherine Gehring, amazing researcher in fungi and microbial communities, and now a nice friend of mine too. And so she introduced me to this new world to me. And remember, I was working on this pinyon pine, the Pinus edulis, and she has been working with the fungal community there. And we found that there is one type of species of the genus Geopora, earth, and pore, like they are tiny little ascomycota, that's what we call it. They look like the cup fungi. And they actually associate with the roots of the plants. And these type of fungi are called mycorrhizae, ectomycorrhizae in this case. And in that case, plants produce photosynthesis or have photosynthesis, produce byproducts, glucose, and they give the sugars to the fungi, and the fungi in return is going to give them nitrogen, phosphorus, and also access to water, and expand the access to the land, to the soil. So that's a win-win, and that's what we call the mutualism interactions. So that's very important in that case. But you see not all of the mushrooms interact in that way, and not all of the fungus that make ectomycorrhizae are actually going to have the same effect. So some species of this genus Geopora actually make some of the trees drought tolerant. And when we discovered that, it was like, wow. And there is genetic basis for that. So we have some studies showing that there is a genetic basis for the association, the preference to interact with one species of fungus over other species. So those are examples of that, but also we know that a lot of the plants are going to be producing the sugars, and they are also going to be producing exudates, which are also sugars, in the root system. And they're going to be feeding bacteria. So as soon as they start producing, the bacteria come, and then they help feeding the plant. So all these microorganisms are going to feed back, and then the plant can be flourishing. So you might be thinking, oh, it's a waste of energy to be, dipping your energy or wasting your energy to bacteria in the soil. Like, who cares? But no, actually, that's a system that works very nice. And then we don't talk about, most people think, oh, we're going to be fixing the carbon into the tissues of plants. But a lot of the carbon is actually sequestered in the soil. And a lot of the root systems that they got very deep are going to be sequestering a lot more carbon than, very superficial plants. And in our agricultural systems, a lot of the roots are very, very shallow. Yeah. And so it's the type of practices that we have that have caused that. And that's an issue. So we need to revolutionize our practices. There is some research looking into modifying genetically the expression of the root system so that they can produce more suberin and store more carbon. But I think that's cool, but actually it might be just about the practices that we have, that we can not modify the plants, but actually modifying our practices and have a better agricultural systems.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I know I'm a gardener, and I think that's kind of been a big thing nowadays is like use mycorrhizae especially with young plants, they'll help them spread their root network. Well, that's good to know. So I wanted to go back. I was talking about warming, but maybe what I was getting at was the CO2 levels. Do you think that kind of clarifies that issue of, well, maybe the simple picture of pre-industrial levels were a neat, tidy picture, but does it help to think better about more CO2 levels, or like you mentioned, methane?
Yeah. So, I mean, during the Holocene, or like kind of thinking about when people had an impact, or
is it true that what we have today, where we have all these factories and cars and everything, and we're emitting so much CO2 has never? Well, we know that it has happened in the past, but like I've been saying on the podcast, the Earth was a very different place at that time. Maybe that's a way to think about it. Was it a different place when there were higher CO2 levels that we're going to get to now, where we're at 430 parts per million?
Yeah. So, the last time the CO2 levels were as high as kind of where we are and where we're headed, you really have to kind of go back into the Pliocene, so many millions of years in the past. And but there have been more recent time intervals when temperature has been kind of higher than it is today. So, for example, oftentimes folks use kind of not the Holocene, but the last interglacial, the one before that, it was a bit warmer than temperatures are right now. At least we think so. And sea level was higher, and so we can use those time intervals as pseudo analogs. But they're always going to be pseudo analogs because the boundary conditions are different. So, we had different amounts of starting CO2 or starting sea level. We had different atmospheric forcing in terms of, astronomical forcing in terms of where Earth is in terms of its various orbits, and so nothing, and the forcing in terms of what's causing warming today is different than what was necessarily causing warming during these past time intervals, and the rate is quite different. So when we look into Earth history for these warmer than present times, or times when CO2 levels were higher than they are today and more similar to where we're headed, it's never going to be a direct analog, right? Mm-hmm. And so you always have to take into account that the Earth looked different, and the other thing I think to take into account is that our infrastructure, our needs as a society, right? Like we weren't necessarily, we were potentially more mobile than we are today, more flexible, and we don't have that same level of flexibility today to deal with large swings in the climate system. So it's not only were the boundary conditions different, the forcing of what's driving changes in climate different, but the impact on people and other ecosystems is going to be wildly different than it is today. And so I think that's always very, very important to consider when we're thinking about using past times. It's very useful in many ways, but it's never a direct comparison. Yeah.
Gotcha. So do you both think that the general consensus that the Southwest and Southern California is going to be more dry? We're going to have this drier climate probably, or continuing what we've seen where it's like, I think climate whiplash is one term I've heard, where, California will have years where it's exceptionally wet, years where it's exceptionally dry. Where do you see that? Short-term future, 100 years, 1,000 years, what are you thinking?
I can comment quickly on that. My sister is actually part of the IPCC, so we talk a lot of these things at home, and so she, a lot of the science that we have is actually supporting that we're going to have extreme events. Yeah. And we have to get prepared for that, and we are actually experiencing it already. So 1 year is super dry, or year, or maybe the same, we have intense fires associated to the drought, and then the next year we might have a lot of flooding and massive storms, and they're going to be wiping away our soils that we already talked that they are super important. So I think for us it's very relevant, and we are running against time about how to incorporate changes in the infrastructure, the landscape, to prevent the erosion of the soils, that mitigate the chances of losing people and the diversity, etc. So I think that's my take on that. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's important is El Nino and La Nina events. Part of this extreme events that affect our region. I think the consensus is that extreme events are more likely to come, but it is also, there is controversy in the literature as to how El Nino will respond to future changes in warming, and exactly how that will change in the future and how that will affect our region. So it's a big challenge, and I think that's one of, especially thinking about hydroclimate as well as extreme events in temperature, that's challenging and really important in terms of impacts to people and ecosystems. It's more than temperature. It's the rainfall has huge impacts. So
okay, yeah, it's all interconnected. That's really the bottom line. Well, I think it is time for us to go to listener questions. So if you have questions for our guests, please don't ask me questions. I'm not the expert yet, but Judy can hand you the microphone. So does anybody want to kick us off? Go ahead. Okay, thanks, Dawn.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking about your work. I'm also part of the geography department, so I think kind of in interdisciplinary terms. So I was wondering how both of you would say that your work kind of fits into a policy background.
So I don't do much policy in terms of my actual work, but I think my work should feed into making policy. So, a lot of what I'm trying to understand is, we didn't really talk about this yet, but feedbacks in the climate system, right? So you increase temperature and then you can set off a whole array of responses, and constraining how strong those feedbacks will be when we cross tipping points, those sort of things. And so thinking about, how urgent changes are needed. Some of that can come from the work that I do, but I have not historically been working directly on policy, but I hope that my work will feed into it.
Yeah, I think a lot of scientists, we don't have that training, like, the hardcore, you're like, the models and the genomes and those genes and going into the field. And for me, it has been a gradual change in mentality to realize that, okay, I'm studying this because I'm very passionate about the research, and then, how is this impacting the community, and how is this making a better world, better than we could find it possibly. So before, I used to think that my science will inform managers, and that was about it. And then I realized that a lot of times there is a disconnect between the science that we do and the managers, and then you actually have to do a lot of work, in groundwork and connecting with people. And I've been learning it little by little, so I don't have a background on that, but then I'm very open, and I do a lot of work talking to people and convincing them. And I talk to people in the Forest Service, and okay guys, we know this, what do you think, how can do this better? So I've been working with a lot of partners in that regard. For example, I've been supporting some initiatives to list some species, right, like threatened species, so that they have special protection categories, and definitely I've been more vocal, but it has been growing and a journey for me. Yeah, if that helps. Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to thank our two speakers and our hosts for coming together today. These are really important discussions to be having. And it sounds like you two come from really interesting fields and important fields of research and study. And it sounds like you two are both out in the field or ocean collecting samples for your research. And I just had a question about, how do you determine where you're collecting those samples? Is it random? Are you using specific data sets to kind of pinpoint where you want to collect those from, and what sorts of data sets are you using?
It's definitely not random. So when we're going out into the field, it's always driven by a question that you want to answer. So, for example, I led an expedition off the coast of Chile in 2019, and we wanted to go there because it's a really important region in the climate system. You have important atmospheric features, the southern westerly winds, which go around Antarctica and impact the global climate system. You have waters that are forming in this region that subduct into the interior of the ocean and fill and influence things far afield. So global impacts. You have the Patagonia ice sheet on land, which is retreating really quickly right now. So we wanted to go there to think about, how has climate in this region changed over particular time intervals? How has this wind field impacted climate on land and in the ocean? How do they feed back together? But then, you're going to a particular region to answer questions, but you need the actual archive that's going to record that, right? And I like to think about things happening on short timescales. Now, we're looking into the geologic record, and so it's very rare that we can get things that are on truly human timescales. But high resolution for me is like 1,000-year resolution, maybe 100-year resolution, right? And if you go out into the middle of the ocean, you get, a centimeter of sediment per million years, right? You're not going to have the ability to see what's happening on these shorter timescales. So I'm trying to target sections where sediment accumulates rapidly, and so I can get this high resolution record of how climate has evolved and other kind of climate features in the region. So, and then we're going out on these ships, and that costs tens of thousands of dollars a day to be out there, and so everything is pretty well orchestrated. Generally where you're going. Some types of expedition, the exact GPS coordinate. Exactly you have a pretty good idea of exactly how far you're going to core beneath the surface. So you have to maximize your time. So it's there's a lot that goes into planning these. Some of the expeditions I've been in have been in the works for more than a decade before you actually go out to sea and collect your samples. So ship time is an incredibly valuable resource, and you want to make sure that you're going to the right place, you have the right sediment package. And the other thing too, which is really fun about this, is these are large projects. I am not going out to sea by myself to collect things for myself and my students. I'm going out with at least, usually like 30 other scientists, right? And we all have our own scientific goals that are complementary. So we'll all be working on the same samples, but we'll be doing different things. And sometimes that can be as disparate as, I'm looking at paleoclimate and paleoceanography, but someone else is interested in the microbes that live in the deep sea environment. So, we try to maximize the impact of everywhere we go, because it really is a super valuable resource to be out there.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Yeah, right. And I have been in some of the expeditions with people, but that's not the usual. So I've been lucky, and if you guys have the opportunity to go in an expedition like that, you learn a lot from different disciplines, right? It's super
100%, yep.
valuable. But in my research, I usually go with a smaller group of people, usually with myself and some of my students. And it depends on the type of questions that we are asking. For example, I had this student, Kyle Gunther. He wanted to investigate the assemblage of the flora in Baja California in the Sky Islands. And I was telling you guys that the peninsula moved from Mexico, right? It's separated. So we were trying to reconstruct what happened and how this different vegetation evolved. And we're looking at the tips of the mountains to compare them and see how long ago they separate, etc. So we had to go to Mexico and then get permits, right? And so you can only go to the places that you have permits. So that's one of the limitations. Then we have to go in some places and hike, or not hike, hike. Accessing by car, cool. Then, okay, we have to hike, that's fine. But then in some places the hurricane, because in 2007, I think, a hurricane passed right and destroyed some of the roads. And then the only way to access it was by mule. So we have to go talk to some locals, and we made it possible. And then we went with mules to this expedition, and then we got the permits. And then you have permits for importing the material in here, right? So there is a lot of logistic. We have another question on how, if plants, some cactus that are native to the archipelago of Bahia de Los Angeles, if they are actually moving the pollen across the islands. And because that's important for the genetic diversity and their health of the species. So we went there, and we need to go to all the islands to survey what islands actually of the 15 to 16, depends on the author, they actually have the cactus. And then based on the presence or absence, you will be collecting the material, right? And of course you need permits. So there is some protocols, designs, and the distance from certain plants to collect, right? And there's a lot of considerations, but I just wanted to share some of the things that we had experienced. Mm-hmm.
Other question. Over there.
Yeah, we have time for a few more questions.
So I'm just wondering, through your guys' years of experience, what's the saddest thing that you guys have learned about our current global standpoint or future? And if you guys could answer how corporate greed or human greed have put us in kind of like this tight space regarding our future.
That is a tough question to answer. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the saddest thing is that, there are lots of things we still want to learn about the climate system, right? But, we know far and above what we need to know to make decisions. At present, that would be beneficial. And I think it's not a specific thing, but it's just a sad thing to know that we have this knowledge, we've had it for a while. And, there's just still, we can't get past some of this to make change. So, I think that's probably the saddest thing is that we know what the answer is and we just can't get there. Yeah.
I think there is a lot of information about how gloomy the future looks, and actually, I don't like to. I think there is the risk that when we talk about it, that we focus on that and we create a lot of fear. And fear, I think, is the reason why we haven't passed that, because then we don't act.
Yeah.
And then I think with information, when we actually talk about the information, we need to do this and this, and we're gonna do it. And guys like you are, you have million ideas that we can probably haven't thought about it, and you can come up with these new alternatives and solutions, and we can work together. So I'm actually more about like, okay, this is the issue, and we need to solve it this way. So I rather talk about the ways to fix it together.
Okay, on the same note about not being a Debbie Downer about it all, what would you say is something you see as very inspiring at looking towards the future in solving the climate crisis?
I think it's, the involvement and, how deeply students like you guys, folks who are even younger than you are, the passion and that is, I think, what gives me hope and inspiration. And I also think, we have the capabilities, right? Like we have the technology. It's possible, and I think that's also one of the things. There's kind of climate change is caused by humans, right? But there's a power in that. If it was natural and this was a natural cycle, it would be very difficult to fix, right? And I think there's a power in knowing that. This is how it happened. This is how we fix it. And that is an inspiring outlook. It's not in theory an intractable problem. Yeah.
But even for me, it's regardless if people acknowledge it, that is natural or not, we have the issue. So you cannot deny it, right? You have these intense droughts, and we're going to be struggling with food, with water, maybe wars and things like that we need to develop strategies to address that. So I think we really need to be looking for it. So I see a lot of that as well, same as you, with our students. you guys are so inspirational. So you just look at yourself, and you really, like in my lab, my students are amazing. I love them so much. I love you, students. But yeah, they are they motivate me, to do this. And also, the community, when you reach out to communities, they want to work. They want to work with us, with the university, especially when this university, they trust us a lot. And they want to, plan. If we say like, oh yeah, let's plant this in this area, and okay, I'm gonna take care of these plants, and we're gonna be collecting from these areas, and it's really, really nice. So I think it's all collectively, and be kind. Be kind to each other. We are in this together, so there is not gonna be a difference. Your race is not gonna matter. I don't know, if you go to SDSU or other universities, we're going to be having to share the resources together. So we need to, at this point, start addressing those issues. Yeah.
So we have time for more questions, and I wanted to open that forum to more people.
Yeah, I guess I want to ask, from what you guys know, sort of what species are more vulnerable to climate change, if in the water or in land, and how is climate change sort of changing the interactions between species and environments?
Yeah, so one of the impacts of rising atmospheric CO2 is you end up getting rising CO2 in the oceans as well that cause ocean acidification. So in the ocean, we are worried about organisms that are making their hard parts out of calcium carbonate, and in particular those that make them out of aragonite. It's kind of a slightly different chemical structure, and it is just more susceptible to dissolution. So those are among the organisms in the ocean that are particularly susceptible to rising atmospheric CO2. But I admit I'm not a biologist, so I am not probably up to date on the particular species that are facing the highest degree of challenges in the modern environment. But certainly ocean acidification, marine heat waves, all of these things are impacting our marine species pretty significantly.
I think we have a lot of species that are collapsing for several things. Insects are collapsing a lot. I was just in a talk about frogs, about amphibians, and how some of the diseases that are also related to, some of the Anthropocene. Let's put it that way. They are dying massively. In the realm of plants, we have a lot of examples. I was mentioning Pinocedrus is considered a barometer for climate change because it just started dying massively, and the rate of evolution is slower than the pace that they are dying. So we have several examples on how different species are responding to different things. So some of the plants might grow actually larger, bigger under climate change because they can sequester more carbon, but then you can think that that's a cool thing, right? It's like, okay, they're bigger, cool, but actually they might have lower nutrition, not like the nutrients, they might have lower nitrogen, and they might have other effects in the ecosystem. So definitely, depending on the species, it might be different. And you mentioned something about the interactions with other species, right? So we have examples of how plants, they produce flowers, some of them produce flowers, and they might depend on the insects to come and pollinate them. And with climate change, the plant might still produce the flower at the same time, they might not care, but the pollinator might actually move their life cycle because they are trying to escape the heat. Or maybe the plant is delaying the flowering, but the insect, it's kind of moving in the opposite direction. So now it's a mismatch on the things that before they were functioning in an orchestrated fashion. Now they are disrupted. And it's the same with the underground, with the microbial communities. you have these associations that sometimes climate change might disrupt and might change the abundance of these, and it has effects on the nutrition and the water acquisition and things like that. So really, for me, is some of these plants are more susceptible or less susceptible, but we need to focus about what's the magnitude of these species, the contribution to the ecosystem. And I mentioned trees are super valuable, super important to the ecosystem. So when the tree species collapses, the whole ecosystem is going to collapse. So I think that probably we need to prioritize in the relevance for these networks in nature.
Hi, I'm the Digital Humanities Initiative Assistant. So I kind of wanted to ask about digital tools. I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe how the impact of more widespread digital use is impacting climate, from mining for materials and how that affects things, but then also maybe digital tools allowing for better research and maybe even more widespread acknowledgement through digital, mediums. And so, yeah.
So, I think we all kind of got we're forced into more than a taste of this during the pandemic. And I think there were pros and cons of that. We all got used to being on Zoom, and I think that opened up greater communication between labs across the country and the world. And that was awesome. So, instead of us having our lab meeting with just folks, at that point I was at a different university, in our own lab group there, we were inviting folks from other universities to attend them and share their work. So, and some of that has continued. It opened up accessibility to a lot of folks coming to conferences who may not have the resources to travel. But then at the same time, there is something lost, right? By not having people travel and you're having a fully digital conference. I'm speaking at a conference in a week, I guess. And, half the people are going to be there in Germany, and I'll be here in San Diego, and the interactions with folks it's great that I can attend, but it's still not the same thing of being there and kind of having that interpersonal connection. A lot of collaborations that I've had, a lot of them come from being stuck at sea from people for months at a time, but also, over dinner after an interesting day at a conference, and you kind of lose those aspects of it. But I think just the connection and sustained collaboration. So you might have those kind of really strong connections that you have at conferences or at sea in person, and it's easier to sustain that than over time because the barriers to working together are just a lot lower. So I think for me, that's kind of in my work where I've seen that impact be the greatest.
I have I had the privilege to be part of this consortium of the herbaria in California. Herbarium are places where it's a collection of plants that we dry, we press, we go to the field, we collect them, we press them, and we archive them in a building, right, in some cabinets. We actually have one in San Diego State University in the biology department. I will invite you to go over to take a look. And I was in this grant that the idea was to digitize all the specimens recorded for some families across all of these 22 institutions. And with this information, what the type of research questions that we were going to be asking was, are the flowering or the fruiting production changing in time? Because in the herbarium, you also have labels of when this was collected. And then we have a lot of people doing that. We have a lot of citizen science approach, which people were coming and helping us transcribe the information, like identifying the flowers and the fruits and say, okay, this was happening, this specimen has this information. And then you can make correlations of in the last century, for example, given these conditions, environmental conditions, are these plants changing the phenology? Are they increasing the flowering or decreasing the time of flowering, etc.? And that was really valuable, right? So this is something that is accessible to everybody. So if you go online, you can access to all these herbaria and have very high quality images of all the plants collected in the past, which is a major achievement. So that's something that is really cool. The other thing I will mention, iNaturalist has really changed. Have you guys used iNaturalist? It's a really good app that you could download in your phone, and then you go out and you look at the plant, take a picture, and the system kind of with machine learning or whatever, they give you an idea of what type of plant it will be. And it's very accurate. It's really cool. And then if you do that, you actually help us knowing what's out there first, what the species are out there in nature, and what state are there. Are they blooming? Do they have a pollinator visiting them? All of those cute pictures that you guys take for Instagram, post them in iNaturalist, because we have a better understanding of nature. And I will say this has definitely helped us to understand how climate change is affecting the species and where the species are moving, etc. So definitely there are several resources in that realm. Yeah.
And if I could just applaud both of our speakers, because both of you have a really good online presence. You're on YouTube, you've been on podcasts before. So that's a really big part of the work. That's why we wanted to have these climate talks, is to give professors a chance to step outside of academia, talk to the public, talk to each other. And that's a really big part of it, is giving, average people the information, and then they can decide and then go and act on that. But if I could answer your question, I think the short, I don't want to give you a long-winded answer, but I think the short answer is mining for things like copper, lithium, cadmium, cobalt. We can talk more about that maybe after. But does anybody else have a question for us? Yeah?
Where was the question? Oh.
Yeah, up front. We like to amplify it because it is a podcast.
Yeah, before my question, I just wanted to mention an app for geologists or people interested in geology. It's called ROCKD, ROCKD, I think it's what it's called. And I don't know how accurate it is, but I use it a lot in undergrad, and it'll tell you the geologic history of where you are, which is really cool. But my question has to do with collaboration in academia. You mentioned that it's really important in having these discussions because climate is such an interdisciplinary field. And my question is, what would you like future scientists, I guess us as research, or I'm a grad student now, how would you ask us or want us to approach collaboration in the future in terms of climate?
I think that's a good question. It's a hard one. It's a hard one exactly to answer. And I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is just to remain open-minded and talk to people. Even though we're moving towards I think a more interdisciplinary way of working, there are still some, you're in departments, and even within those departments, you kind of tend to have more natural things to talk about in terms of science with people who are doing things that are more similar to you. I think some of the things is be open-minded to talking about things that are totally outside of your discipline, because they actually might not end up being the case ultimately. And don't be afraid to go talk to people who are doing things that are a bit different than you. Because I think a lot of it too, you kind of end up working in your little office, and even people who you might work with down the hall for years, you don't actually know exactly what they're working on, right? And then one time over coffee, you're like, oh my gosh, I do something really similar to that, and you had no idea that whole time. So yeah, I think just open communication and open-mindedness are some of the things that will serve you well in terms of finding collaborations that you might not expect, and to just be bold. You also think like, oh, this person, maybe they don't want to hear about my work. Like, it's that's rarely the case that is actually what somebody might be thinking, and you can foster fun projects that way. So
for me, it has been more about the curiousness. Is that a word? Curiousness. Thank you. I knew that there was something wrong with that. Thank you. Yeah, a curiosity. I feel like I have developed a lot of multidisciplinary collaborations because I'm curious about things. So I feel like I want to understand something more, and I try to grab different sources of information, and I'm very open, as you were saying too, and that has helped a lot. The other thing that has helped for me to develop a very wide network of collaborations or collaborators is to travel. So I have done, my 2 postdocs over here, and then Australia. I was in Australia before, so I still work with them. And, you have all of these different people with different ideas from different backgrounds. I work a lot with tribal communities. We have a different cosmovision of nature, and then, I learn a lot from them every day. And so really being curious, being respectful of everybody, and also knowing that you don't have the ultimate truth, but actually when you bring another discipline and more people from your outside world, you have a better reality or a better understanding of the universe. So I think that's key. And I have Judy actually is one of our students in our next gen grant, and this is a collaboration of many faculty across the colleges, 4 colleges, different disciplines, but it's with the idea of dealing with a lot of challenges, and at the core is the health of the soils, and climate change over here, biodiversity, water management, the foods, the nutrition, diets, economics, all of that together. And I think when we approach things like that, we can get meaningful changes. That's my
contribution. Could you go into that a little bit more? I don't know if you're able to.
We are at time.
Okay.
Sorry. So I do have a question for you all, which is, are you hungry? Because we have a ton of food. So I don't know. I do invite you all to continue the conversation outside, but I do want to be mindful of folks' times, and a very sincere and heartfelt thank you. That was incredible. So thank you all so much.
Yeah. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all. Please enjoy the food. Thank you for coming, and this podcast will be uploaded soon. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.